Okay? Right. Okay. Hello again. In the second part of this talk, we're actually going to go on and look briefly at business decision making. In particular, starting off by, are we any good at making decisions from a business perspective, but then going on to look at some of the things we should be thinking about making decisions, improving decision making in a business context. There's not actually much information out there as to whether or not we're any good at making decisions in a business context. And the one bit of information that I've ever come across was a survey that was carried out by what was then Capgemini, their business decisiveness report. And they carried out a survey of a number of organisations and senior executives in that organisations. We've got some data of the typical size of a decision at the time it was carried out, which perhaps about 10 years ago. And as part of that, they also asked people what they thought about the quality of their decisions. What was their miss rate? How many of their decisions did they think were actually wrong? And they declared that about 24% of their decisions were not good decisions. They were wrong decisions. What they actually meant by that we'll discuss in a minute. And that amounted to a loss of about 0.8 of a million per executive per year. And there's a bit more data there that around those decisions, the data that they actually collected. And at the bottom there, you can actually see the assessment of the organisation's decision capability. So only 13% of the people that were questioned thought that their organisation had a very good decision capability. 45% were good, 33% didn't really know, and 2% said poor. Actually, I think they're perhaps exaggerating. I'm sure there must be more than 2% of poor decision-making organisations out there. But that's the only sort of data that is around that I'm aware of. When we're actually thinking about what makes a good decision, there are some key questions of decision-making. There are some key questions we need to ask. What is a good decision in the first place? What were those executives actually thinking about when they were answering those questions? If we were trying to ask them precise questions, what would we actually ask them? You're here in the business school, and a key part, as we saw at the beginning, of business is making decisions and helping others make good decisions. So trying to have a sense of what a good decision is really important. Associated with that, is there a difference between a good decision and the right decision? Is a good decision the right decision? What do people mean by those terms? How often do managers need to be right? If you're a good decision maker, do you have to be right all the time? And what about the process itself? What's a good decision process? So I'm going to talk briefly about all of these aspects. What is a good decision? I'd like you to start thinking for yourselves what a good decision is. And it's a question that I often ask in class. There's lots of different answers that come up when you ask that question. And one that generates a lot of debate, I was involved in one of these debates when I did my own PhD over 30 years ago, is a good decision one that necessarily has a good outcome. And just on LinkedIn a couple of days ago, a discussion forum came around having exactly the same discussion. So this notion of whether good decisions and good outcomes are synonymous, or whether you can have a good decision and a bad outcome, or a bad decision and a good outcome, is quite a conundrum. I'll leave you to think about what your view on this is, but mine is that the two things are hopefully correlated, that good decisions, which in my view depend a lot on the actual processes, hopefully will lead to good outcomes more often than bad decisions, which sometimes by chance will actually lead to good outcomes. Another thing that you might think about in decision making is it just the decision that you're thinking about? There's a joke that a psychology friend of mine tells. There are 10 psychologists sitting on a wall and they've all decided to jump off. How many psychologists are still on the wall? And depending on your view on life, you might answer none because they've all jumped off. But anybody who's wise to this says there's still 10 psychologists sitting on the wall because they decided to jump off, but none of them actually did it. So there's a difference between making the decision and actually putting it into practice, the action that follows up. And those two things are not independent. Your decision-making process, how you actually make the decision, should take account of what's going to happen after the decision moment, if indeed there is a decision moment. Often it's a much more evolutionary process. Is it one that satisfies the decision maker's objectives? We need to know what those are. What does satisfies actually mean? Does it mean achieving a certain level? Does it mean a maximising type of approach, as we see here? Is it one that maximises profit? Clearly, in the study that we've just looked at, the Capgemini study, there's some concern about costs there. So the decisions that they see as bad decisions seem to be associated with decisions that have incurred unnecessary costs. But that's an important aspect of decision making, but not always the only aspect. Similar to maximising profit, is it one that leads to the greatest benefit? How do you actually go about defining benefit? Is it one that is robust? So it could be robust in a number of ways. One that's actually going to remain in place a long way over time. One that actually satisfies a lot of people. There are lots of different dimensions to robustness. Is it one that everybody agrees with, as I just mentioned? Or is it one that's well made, one that has a good process that's underpinning it? And as I said a few minutes ago, is a good decision the same as a right decision? Moving on to the question of how often does a manager need to be right, there's some interesting writing in that special issue of the Harvard Business Review. And it depends on the context, it depends what you're actually making decisions about. A manager might say they want to be right all the time, but in different contexts that might not be appropriate. So we're given here the context of a baseball player. And apparently baseball players, it's not a sport that I'm very familiar with, if he makes the right decision at the plate a third of the time, is judged to be a superstar. So baseball players, if they get it right 1 in 3 times, are doing really well. However, if a neurosurgeon only got it right 1 in 3 times, then there'd be some worried people out there and worried patients. I'd certainly be thinking again about going into hospital. And for managers, it's felt that the margin of error is somewhere in between. A US entrepreneur, Jovanovic, once told the author of this quote that a person who was right 51% of the time would rise in the organisation, as Jovanovic himself did, from being a textbook salesman to being the CEO of a Fortune 50 publisher. But Jovanovic himself actually made lots of mistakes, and in the context of teaching, I'm often telling students that it's important to make mistakes because they're really good learning opportunities. You're probably going to learn a lot more by getting something wrong than you actually learn by getting something right. You should be reflecting in both cases, but it's the getting it wrong that really makes you think hard. And so in business, if you actually get something wrong, you're probably going to learn a lot from that you can then actually go on and use in other contexts. So Mr. Jovanovic, despite his success that we're told about in the first quote, actually made a number of mistakes and lost a lot of money, one of which actually led to him going out of business at the end of the day. So you don't have to be right all the time, whatever right actually means. You don't have to be successful, but getting a good balance is important. And how do you actually go about doing that? So I'm going to look at some characteristics of a good decision process. And one aspect of that is actually paying attention to all phases of the process. And you need different thought processes and different skills in different stages of the process. So the framing and structuring needs to be a sort of opening up process, making sure that you're taking account of all the views. And as part of this course, your experience in the business school, you learn lots of tools and techniques that can help with framing and structuring a problem. So making sure that you actually spend that time to make sure it's well framed, it's not framed in a biased way, you understand what all the options are. So it's the background thinking, the initial research about the problem. And then moving on to the intelligence phase, actually going out and getting some data. So having understood what the issues are, what do you actually need to know about? What intelligence do you need? Is it hard data? Is it people's opinions? Do we have to be concerned about how the public's going to react to a decision if we're a public organisation? So actually going out and getting that intelligence moves into another set of processes which themselves need to be well designed, and people working in the marketing arena will be very familiar in getting intelligence about what consumer perspectives are. Statisticians will be very well informed about designing surveys in some other areas. So there's lots of different ways on looking at that. Then there's the moment of actual deciding. How do you actually bring all that together in order to decide where to go next? And that's the area where my own research is very much focused, helping people identify what are the important issues that have come out of the first two stages, weighing those up, considering different stakeholder perspectives in order to arrive at a decision. But then also reflecting on the whole process. So when you actually get there, was it a good process? What have you learned from it? Are there things that you've actually missed out on that you should think about in future? So once you actually get in organisations, just as in an educational context, reflection is important. A reflective practitioner is an effective practitioner is a quote that is often used. So make sure that all those aspects, all those phases of the process are well attended to. Another characteristic of a good decision process that very much links back to what we've seen earlier in those examples that illustrate the effects of different ways of framing problems is to try and devise a process so it avoids effects of framing. One way of doing that is ensuring that you get lots of different multiple perspectives in the process. So you don't just get a bunch of marketing people perceiving the problem as a marketing problem. You get marketing people working together with economists, maybe with accountants, maybe with management scientists. So lots of different people will focus on different dimensions of the problem, depending on both their professional training and their own experience. So try and bring all of these different perspectives together, both the professional perspectives and the perspectives of the people who are involved in the decision. So try and get the views of lots of different stakeholders, involving them in different ways in the decision. A specific way of trying to look at different perspectives that I've encountered in practice that De Bono advocates in his writing about decision making as well is the use of devils and angels advocates. So if you're actually choosing between a number of different ways of doing things, actually appoint someone to each of those options that is there to criticise the option, to look at its negative points, to play the devil's advocate role. What could actually go wrong if we went down this route? And also someone to defend it. What could actually go right? What are the opportunities? What are the potentialities associated with that option? And those two viewpoints tensioned against each other can help try and avoid some of the consequences of framing. But also using an approach which explicitly considers the different criteria. So don't just focus on one criteria and try to think about them all at the same time. Another characteristic is the actual process itself and striking a good balance between jumping the gun, making the decision too quickly and never actually getting to make a decision, so the indecision. So there's a process of debate going on in there, but it doesn't go on too long. You do actually get to the action. So you move from that intelligence gathering process, gathering the information, the divergent thinking, opening things up to make sure that all the options are considered, discussing those and then closing them down again, the convergent process, and coming to the conclusions and enabling you to move on. As you start to implement things, you might open them up and close them down again. So it's not just one phase of this process. You might have multiple phases of divergent, convergent thinking, divergent, convergent thinking again, as the implementation of whatever it is you're deciding about evolves. But make sure that you alternate between these two processes and don't get stuck in one or other of the traps, either a groupthink problem, which is a very well-known phenomenon publicised initially by Janis and Mann, where the group actually comes very quickly to a conclusion because the group's a very tight-knit one, it's got a very strong leader, they're not actually questioning what's actually going on outside, so they rapidly come to a view that they agree with and move on to action without thinking about the bigger picture. The opposite problem is the debating society context where you just carry on discussing forever and never move into the convergent phase and actually get any action. You're still discussing the problem because there are new things that are coming up and nobody has actually got the conviction or the courage to actually make a decision. So another characteristic of a good decision process is bringing together intuition and analysis. In the Kahneman book that I showed you at the front there, The Slow and Fast Thinking, he talks about two different modes of thinking, which are the kind of equivalent to intuition and analysis. The intuition is the fast thinking, moving very quickly to decisions, and the analysis is the sort of stepping back and actually being more analytical, thinking more about the different components and how they actually fit together. In practice, they work really well together. So you can actually use some kind of analysis and modelling which might come up with a recommended result to challenge your intuition. But at the same time, your intuitive view should be challenging the modelling and result. If you bring those two things together in a business context, they can be really powerful. There's also a lot of literature on the interaction and the relative value of intuition and analysis. Two papers there from earlier editions of Harvard Business Review, When to Trust Your Gut, giving one of the perspectives, and Don't Trust Your Gut, giving the other perspectives. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of literature that focuses on the intuitive gut feel approach. The Malcolm Gladwell book called Blink is one indication of that. But the Malcolm Gladwell book is very much a sort of popular literature book. There's also a more academic literature around that area and I've forgotten the name of the person that does it. Jonathan Klein. So there's also more academic literature around this subject, in particular initiated by Jonathan Klein, who actually refers to the whole process as naturalistic decision making. And he's talking in particular about contexts like emergency service workers. So a fireman who's actually out there dealing with a blaze in a building will have very quick response times to decide what to do. He's not going to sit down and construct a decision table that says, shall we go upstairs or shall we stay downstairs? How many sort of hoses shall we take with us? How many men shall we take with us? Because by then the building will have burned down. You need to be very quick. But that quickness is not something that's inborn. It comes from experience. And the fire service actually work on that experience, and they work on the reflection. We worked quite closely together with the Strathclyde Fire Brigade a number of years ago, and following any serious incident where there's been a fire and there's been a number of pumps go into that fire, they'll have a debriefing process, going through the whole process, what happened when, in a non-judgmental way, in order to reflect on it and learn from it. And that reflection process can inform that intuitive process and vice versa. So developing an effective intuition and gut thinking is something that comes from lots of experience and practice. It's not something that you're born with. You might be born with an aptitude for it, but you need to actually develop it through that experience. And some people confuse that with a sort of intuitive decision that's made on the basis of no real experience, because really you just feel that that's the right thing to do, which is perhaps what discredits intuitive decision making to some extent, because if you're just going that way because, oh right, I like the look of that small company over there, I'll acquire it, then that's maybe not the best considered decision. So as it says there, even advocates of intuition accept that instincts can be wrong and that the decision traps that we've talked about are still there. These aspects of good decision-making process that I'm talking about are very much incorporated in the book that's listed at the bottom there by Russo and Shoemaker, who titled their book Decision Traps are 10 Barriers to Brilliant Decision Making. So if you want to look in more depth about what I'm talking about here, that's the place to go. So the last element of good decision process is to sort of think through all of these decision traps. We've looked at most of them through the first part of this class and what we've just been talking about here. So I'll just quickly go through them and refer back to where we thought about it. Plunging in, leaping before you actually look. Before you leap into making a decision, think about how you're actually going to make that decision. Who should you actually involve? Step back and think about the decision process. So good decisions are preceded by a meta decision. How are we actually going to make this decision? Who do we need to involve? How long does it need to take? What what processes are we actually going to engage in? How are we going to involve those people? And so on. So think about the process before you get embedded in it. We've talked a lot about frames and frame blindness, so there are lots of examples illustrating the potential impact earlier on, and we talked about some ways of overcoming them earlier. There are a couple of other decision traps that we've not really talked about: overconfidence in judgments, short-sighted, shortcuts, shooting from the hip, thinking you can keep everything in your head and just going for it without stopping and thinking about it. Are other potential decision traps that you find more about if you go and look at Rousseau and Shoemaker. Groupthink we've talked about, and three aspects that are more sort of looking back: fooling yourself about feedback, thinking that you're actually getting positive feedback, you're actually doing well, when you're not, because you're not reflecting sufficiently deeply on what's actually happening. And the last two, specifically relating to the reflective process, not keeping track of what happens, what works, what doesn't work, and not stopping to think retrospectively about the whole process, not auditing it and not reflecting on it, are all indicative decision traps. So I'll leave you with a short message based around that. Avoid the decision traps, and may all your decisions be successful, and I hope I'll meet you somewhere else later in your career at Strathclyde.